It started as a simple gray tunic. By 1945, it had been through a dozen redesigns, worn on frozen eastern steppes, in North African sand, and in the ruins of bombed-out cities. The German Army field uniform is one of the most documented, studied, and debated pieces of military clothing in history. And yet, most people only know the version they see in films. The real story is far messier. Field gray wool that turned to mud, eagle insignia that changed 3 times, collars that went from dark green to gray because a factory ran out of dye, rank badges that crept from the collar to the shoulder to keep soldiers alive in the sniper-riddled trenches of the Eastern Front. This is not a story about politics. This is the story of how 12 years of total war reshaped what a soldier wore, piece by piece, button by button, from 1933 to the last day of the war. Today, we track every major change, era by era, starting with the uniform that launched everything in 1933. Before we go further, if military history is your thing, subscribing takes 2 seconds and means you won't miss a single video in this series. We cover the gear, the strategy, and the decisions that changed the course of the Second World War. Hit subscribe, and let's get into it. When Hitler came to power in January 1933, the German military was still wearing a uniform designed in the shadow of a lost war. The Reichswehr, the tiny 100,000-man army permitted under the Treaty of Versailles, had been making do with leftover Weimar-era kit. Field gray tunics, yes, but simplified, stripped down, and carrying the quiet shame of defeat. The new regime had different ideas. The Feldbluse M, 1933. The first Wehrmacht-era tunic arrived in 1933, and on the surface, it looked almost identical to its predecessor. Field gray wool, 4 front pockets, 9 buttons down the front. But the cut was slightly updated, and it carried a critical new addition, a dark green collar. That collar would become the single most recognizable design element of the early war uniform. Dark green wool, a contrasting band at the neck, pressed and crisp. It looked sharp. It also became a bureaucratic nightmare as the war dragged on and dye supplies ran out. Rank was displayed through shoulder boards for officers and collar patches for enlisted men, using a system of metal pips, braiding, and lace that had roots stretching back to the Imperial German Army. The Wehrmacht was building something new, but borrowing heavily from something very old. The National Eagle, November 1935. On November 6, 1935, an order came down that would define the visual identity of German army uniforms for the rest of the war. Every soldier was now required to wear a national eagle, a woven insignia on the right breast, above the pocket. The early versions were white thread on field gray backing. The pose was slightly different from the eagle you see on later war tunics. Spread wings, head turned right, clutching a wreath. It sounds like a small detail. But once you know what you're looking for, spotting whether a photograph is pre- or post-1935 becomes simple. The eagle tells you everything. Collar patches in the Litzen system. Every enlisted man and NCO wore a pair of Litzen on the collar. These were woven braid patches with a specific pattern of white or gray thread on dark green backing. Officers wore a more elaborate double version called Doppellitzen. The number of bars, the color of the backing, the type of metal on the shoulder boards. These elements told a trained eye exactly who they were looking at, their rank, their branch, sometimes even their regiment. This system worked beautifully in peacetime. It would cause serious problems once artillery started falling. Headgear. The Stahlhelm and the Schirmmütze. The M35 steel helmet was introduced in 1935, an evolution of the iconic World War I design. Slightly more compact with updated liner and chin strap. Paired with the field gray peaked cap, the Schirmmütze for officers, this was the complete look of the early Wehrmacht. Clean, intimidating, and still very much a peacetime uniform. That was about to change. By 1938, the Wehrmacht had already absorbed Austria, annexed the Sudetenland, and marched into Czechoslovakia. The uniform that entered Poland in September 1939 was still recognizably the M1933 system, but with one important update, the M1936 tunic. And this is where the real evolution begins. The M1936 tunic. The Feldblues. M36 was the version that actually went to war. It kept the dark green collar, it kept the breast eagle. But the internal changes mattered. The lining was simplified. The field gray shade shifted slightly toward olive, and critically, it was the uniform that proved what worked and what didn't under actual combat conditions. What didn't work? The dark green collar. In the field, it stood out against field gray in ways that made soldiers uncomfortable, especially once snipers became a daily reality. The complaints started coming in almost immediately. M. 1940. Gray goes all the way. In 1940, the decision was made. The dark green collar was replaced with field gray on new production tunics. Same shade as the rest of the tunic, same wool, no contrast. It looks like a small change in photographs. In practice, it was the Wehrmacht accepting that the war was not going to be short, clean, or forgiving. The breast eagle changed too. The white thread version was replaced with a mouse gray version, subdued, harder to spot at distance. The parade ground was becoming a memory. Rank visibility becomes a liability. By 1941, a new problem had emerged on the Eastern Front. Soviet snipers were specifically targeting officers. The elaborate rank insignia system, all those metal pips and braided shoulder boards, made officers visually distinct at distances where that distinction got you killed. Officers started removing rank insignia in forward areas. Some wore enlisted tunics deliberately. The system designed to communicate authority was communicating something else entirely to a trained shooter 300 meters away. Regulations began to quietly adjust. Rank would eventually migrate to more discreet locations, the M1941 field cap. The officer's peaked cap, elegant as it was unsuitable for frontline wear. The solution was the M41 Einheitsfeldmütze, a simple side cap for all ranks with a fold-down flap for cold weather. Subdued insignia, no brim, practical. It became the standard field cap for the middle period of the war and marked a clear visual break from the polished pre-war look. We're halfway through 12 years of uniform evolution. If you're finding this useful or interesting, dropping a like takes literally 1 second and helps the channel reach more people who care about this stuff. Also, leave a comment telling me which era you find most interesting, the early war look or the late war field gray simplification. I read everyone. Now, back to 1942. The M. 1942. Tunic. War economy takes over. By 1942, Germany's war economy was under serious strain. The M1942 tunic reflected this bluntly. The pleated breast pockets were replaced with flat pockets, simpler to manufacture, faster to produce, cheaper on material. The collar lining was simplified. The lace and decorative elements that had been standard on earlier production runs started disappearing. To a collector today, the M42 looks slightly rougher than its predecessors. That was intentional. The factories needed speed, not elegance. The Litzen disappear from new production. The Litzen collar patches, those woven double bars that had defined German army dress since the 1930s, were dropped from new production tunics in 1943. Existing patches were still worn. Veterans kept their earlier issue tunics, but the assembly line was no longer sewing them on. This was the moment the German Army field uniform stopped looking like a design system and started looking improvised. It wasn't improvised, it was calculated. But the visual effect was the same, tropical and special purpose variants. Worth noting briefly, the field gray tunic was never the only uniform in the system. By 1941, German forces in North Africa were wearing tropical variants in olive and tan. Winter warfare produced padded overgarments and reversible camouflage. Mountain troops, paratroopers, and Waffen-SS all ran parallel uniform systems with their own insignia logic. The field gray tunic remained the baseline, but the war had fractured the Wehrmacht into too many environments for any single uniform to cover. The M1943 tunic and field cap. The M1943 tunic was another step down in construction quality and another step up in production efficiency. The M43 field cap, however, was the uniform update that everyone actually noticed. It replaced the earlier side cap with a visored cap that could be worn by all ranks. Simple, practical. A mild nod back toward the pre-war peaked cap. Enlisted. Men and officers wore essentially the same silhouette. Now, the class signifiers of earlier years ground down by 4 years of war. The Feldblues M, 1944, the war's last uniform. The M44 was the final official change to the German Army field uniform. The skirt was shortened to reduce material use. The number of front buttons dropped from 9 to 6. The internal construction was stripped to its minimum. The breast eagle was now triangular on some versions, reflecting different manufacturers working to different specs as supply chains fractured. By this point in the war, many soldiers were wearing a patchwork of whatever was available. M40 tunics with M43 trousers, M36 collars on M42 bodies, any field cap that fit. Regulations existed, supply did not. From 1933 to 1945, the German Army field uniform underwent more documented changes than almost any other uniform in the war. Each one tells a story. The dark green collar speaks to peacetime optimism. Its removal speaks to the reality of the Eastern Front. The fading breast eagle from white to gray speaks to a military learning, too slowly, what actual camouflage required. The simplified M44 tunic speaks to a war economy in collapse. The uniform that surrendered in May 1945 would have been almost unrecognizable to the soldier who wore the M36 into Poland 6 years earlier. Same field gray, completely different world. If you made it to the end, you now know the German Army field uniform better than most people who claim to be serious about this period. If you want to go deeper, the next video covers the specialist uniforms, the Panzer Black, the assault gun gray, and why the branch color system became one of the most complicated insignia structures in military history. Subscribe so you don't miss it, and if there's a specific uniform, branch, or campaign you want me to cover next, drop it in the comments. I build the series based on what you actually want to see. See you in the next one.